With the vehicle raised and supported off the ground safely, you want to take the lug nut cover off. This is a 21mm socket, by the way. And with a 22mm, take off all the lug nuts. If your wheel is seized onto the hub like this one, put on a lug nut and use a hammer or rubber mallet from the back. Hit the tire, not the rim, and take the wheel off. Next, you want to remove the two 19mm brake caliper mounting bolts. Leave that one in a little bit. Take them both off. With a pry bar, gently pry up here and down here, and remove your caliper. I like to put my caliper up here, that way it's not hanging by the brake hose. Next, for the caliper bracket, you have two 18mm bolts that you're going to have to remove. Leave this one in a little bit so the bracket doesn't fall when you remove the top one. Take them both off and remove your caliper bracket with the pads. At this point, if your rotor is held in with a mounting screw in any of these holes, take it off. It should be a T30. This one's missing, so there's nothing for me to take out. But if you have one, take that out first. I've already sprayed inside of all these holes and around the lug studs with rust penetrant because my rotor is very rusty. Next, I'm going to use a hammer and hit anywhere on the rotor. Just make sure you don't hit the studs, and hopefully this should come off of the hub. Before you do that, you want to make sure you put a lug nut on. That way the rotor doesn't come flying off when you finally break it free. Once your rotor finally breaks free, remove this lug nut and take off your rotor. Next, you want to take off the pads from the brackets. Usually they just slide. And then take the hardware off. At this point, if you have any large metal chunks here, it would be a great time to scrape them with something. You can use a flathead screwdriver, a little pry bar like this. This one looks all right, it's just a lot of surface rust, so I'm going to clean that off with a wire brush. Next, you want to coat these with just a little bit of caliper grease. That'll prevent rust from building up. Next, you want to take your caliper hardware and install it with these two tabs facing down. That's what locks it into the bracket. And press it down all the way. Make sure it does not come off. Do the same on both sides. Next, you want to take off your slider pins. If it doesn't want to come off easily, you can use some pliers. These are the types of boots that are held in with a metal sleeve, so if you have new ones, this would be a good time to replace them. If not, just inspect these, make sure they're still good, they're not torn, and then we'll proceed to cleaning them. If you have a bore brush, you can use a bore brush. If not, go ahead and put a rag in here and then squeeze on the rubber boot. That's going to get all the junk off onto the rag. Do that on both sides. And next, you want to clean up the slider. Make sure that it's clean up there. If you have to take it over to the wire wheel, do that. Just make sure it's clean so that the boot can seal up against the pin. At this point, you want to take some caliper grease and grease up the slider pins. Make sure there's plenty of grease all around, that way they don't seize up. Once you slide them in, put a little bit of grease up here on the top, that way the boot can seal up. Press it in all the way, give it a few twists. Make sure it's seated all the way down. Before you put on the new rotor, clean up the hub, so give it a quick spray with brake clean. This one's actually somewhat clean. What you want to pay attention to is raised areas up along this inner ring and this outer ring. Because there aren't any, I'm just going to quickly wire brush the surface dirt off of here. As you can see, there's a lot of rust here in the middle. I want to get that all off so the rotor can sit flush. Cleaning this well will avoid any brake pulsations or warping of the rotors in the future. Okay, one last rinse. One last thing before you install the rotor is to put some anti-seize on the hub. That'll prevent the hub from rusting onto the rotor like it did this time for a future brake job. And put your rotor on. If you have the securing screw, you want to line up the hole on the hub with one of these. That way you can secure it. I don't have one, mine was missing, so I'm just gonna put it on. However, if you have the plain rotors and not the drilled and slotted, you're gonna wanna clean them with brake clean and a rag. That way you get all the oil coating off of the front and the rear. These are not coated, so I'm just gonna put them on. I will, however, put a lug nut on to hold the rotor in case it wants to fall down. The next step is to reinstall the caliper bracket. Line up the 2 bolts and start them by hand. Then go ahead and run them down, make them snug, and then we'll torque them. You want to torque these bolts to 130 foot-pounds. To push back the 2 pistons, you can use either large pliers with a pad in between. Just make sure that you push both evenly, or you can use a caliper depression tool like this and slowly push them both back. If you're having difficulty pushing them back, that means it's seized and you need a new caliper. All right, once it's done, remove your tool. Clean off the debris that's on the surface here, such as any rust chunks that might be formed here. Next, you want to put a little bit of caliper grease right on the face of the pistons here, where they touch up against the pad. That's going to allow them to operate quietly and smoothly. And put a little bit on these 3 ears as well. Install your pads, make sure they slide in smoothly. If they are not able to pivot smoothly, that means you didn't clean up your bracket enough and they're actually getting jammed in between the 2 ends of the bracket, which is not good. The inboard pad needs to have the squealer or the wear indicator, and I'm going to put that on the top of the pad. That way when the rotor spins clockwise to go forward, it pulls this tab away from the rotor and makes noise, which lets you know that your pads are low. Next, you want to put on the caliper. Start in the top bolt so you can let go of it. Slide it over this slide pin, and then start in your bottom bolt. Bottom these out, and torque these to 30 foot-pounds. You want to start on all your lug nuts. You're going to snug them up and then torque them to 140 foot-pounds. With just a little bit of pressure on the wheel, let's torque these to 140 foot-pounds. And don't forget about your lug nut covers.